Okay, I see 1 o'clock on my end. So I'm gonna get started. I know folks will be coming in, but there's just a few general kind of introductory slides that I'm gonna take over. This is Mitch Horry with the PSC, and I'm just gonna kick us off briefly at the top here before I hand it over to the Cadmus team. So first of all, welcome to the fifth stakeholder committee meeting for this energy efficiency potential study that kicked off almost a year ago. And the last time this full group was together was back in November. And since then, the Cadmus team has been working hard on the modeling of the different types of potential, including the scenarios that we discussed back at that meeting in November. So you'll get a presentation today to discuss those results, those draft results. I want to just take a moment and just thank everyone that's on, everyone that's been engaged throughout this process for all your guidance and insights that you've provided. I think it makes for a much stronger study, and I just want to really express my appreciation and also want to give a special thanks to everyone that participated in the ramp rate review process that was back in March. Cadmus will talk more about that process later in the presentation, but I just wanted to say thanks to the folks that helped out there. I realized it was a new approach, required some thinking outside of the box, and had a pretty condensed timeline. And I was really pleased with the level of response that came back, and I think it just illustrates the commitment and passion folks have for the program. So again, I just wanted to make sure I said thank you at the top here on that. You can go to the next slide, please, Lakin. Just generally, as with the prior meetings, ask that you please remain muted during the presentation with your video off. We're going to stop along the way to take questions. As you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat, and that'll be monitored, and those questions will be addressed throughout. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Jeremy, who's going to run through the agenda and what to expect in terms of the draft report that's forthcoming.
Thanks, Mitch. So this is the main body of our agenda today. Our focus today is to present to you our draft results of our potential study. And when we really get into the details, we're going to start with a recap of the potential study methods at a pretty high level, since over the course of many meetings we've gotten into the weeds. But we'll do a brief recap. Then we're going to go into the results from the technical potential piece of the study, and we'll include our sector level results and also a comparison to the 2017 study, and discuss some of the key changes that happened between the two studies that drive some of the differences. Then we'll pause for Q&A. Then we'll go into economic potential and have a very similar structure for the electric and gas results. Then, before going into optimized and current policy potential, we're going to recap the results of our stakeholder ramp rate engagement process and let you all know some of the results and feedback that we got there. And then we're going to go into optimized and current policy potential draft results. And then finally, we're going to cover our scenarios. So in total, we have over 50 slides. So we have a lot of content to go through. We're going to do our best to keep it moving, but we will pause after every section to take questions. And as always, if you could please either speak during those pauses or put your questions in the IM. And so before going into the kind of main body of our presentation, we wanted to take another look at our timeline and also let you all know what's coming moving forward. So as you can see, we're nearing the end of this process. So today's presentation is focused on our draft results, and we're looking forward to your comments and feedback during the presentation. Following this presentation, we are going to share with you a draft of the report on June 4th and provide you about 3 weeks to provide comments on that in written form. And then we'll incorporate those comments and address those for the final version of the study, which will then be presented to the PSC and stakeholders later this summer. So essentially, there's two rounds of initial feedback today, and then you will also get a draft copy of the report to provide written comments on. And you can go ahead now. And so this is a brief preview of the report structure. So the first draft report that will be shared with you initially includes an executive summary, a recap of our methodology and approach, and then our results across technical and economic potential, and then optimized and current policy potential. It also includes a benchmarking section and conclusions and recommendations. Additionally, this year, we'll include a write-up of income qualified barriers and opportunities that came out of interviews that we did with income qualified stakeholders as part of this study. And so this will be essentially the meat of the whole study. And then as that's being reviewed, we will still pull together a whole list of appendices, including a much more detailed methodology, results from our surveys and site visits, baseline data, and then many more details about our assumptions and scenario analyses, as well as our various interview guides and research instruments.
Yeah, this is Mitch with the PSC. I'll take this slide. We've shown this timeline with at the other stakeholder meetings throughout this study, just to give a sense to where this potential study integrates with the broader planning for Focus on Energy. The potential study is the first step in a multi-step process, and so what you can expect over the next year is, following the potential study release, commission staff will be putting out a call for comments on scope decision items for the commission for the next quad of focus. So that'll occur in the fall under the 5 FE 104 docket. And then over the winter, we'll take those comments in. Commission staff will develop a memo to present a draft of that for stakeholder comment as well for written comments, which ultimately ends with a memo for the commission that presents a host of decision alternatives for their consideration. And then they make those decisions at an open meeting, and then going from there, we've got direction for the next quad of focus, which begins on January 1st, 2023. I wanted to take a minute to plug a couple other opportunities for stakeholder involvement. The first is under the 5 EI 158 docket that the Commission recently opened. That's also being referred to as the Carbon-Free Roadmap docket. And so right now, that docket is open for comments with a pretty broad scope, including all issues relevant to the clean energy transition, which which also includes focus and other customer programs. So that comment period that identifies issues for further evaluation closes on May 14th. The second opportunity is for a rooftop solar PV potential study that will accompany this energy efficiency potential study. The commission approved funding for a rooftop solar PV potential study back in February. That will take a look at the potential for rooftop solar at a statewide level. And we do plan to do a series of stakeholder meetings over the summer, much like the format of these meetings. There is a link to an online sign-up form, should be the top item in the chat. If you are interested and want to receive meeting invites for those meetings over the summer, you can do so. It's the same link I sent out in an email probably a couple months back. So if you've already signed up, no need to do so again. And also, if you have colleagues that you think might be interested, please feel free to share that sign up link. The schedule for the solar PV potential study is going to be far more condensed than the EE study, so that we can maintain this timeline for quad planning. So it'll be a pretty intensive period over the summer, and we anticipate that a report will be published and available some weeks after the EE potential study. So we're trying to put those two studies together so that we could have them available in time for additional quad planning activities in the fall and winter. That was all I wanted to say on that.
All right, well, thank you, Mitch. Hi, everyone. My name is Lakin Garth with the Cadmus Group, and my role in the project was modeling lead. And so today, I have the fortunate opportunity to lead our team in presenting draft results of the energy efficiency potential study. I'll just first begin by echoing Mitch's sentiments by thanking everyone for being here and for being a part of this project. It's been our privilege and honor to work on this, and we really want to extend a couple of special thanks, particularly to those folks who graciously volunteered for reviewing ramp rates and providing suggestions, and also to our utility partners who, way back at the start of the pandemic, which feels like a lifetime ago, responded to a very thorough data request, and a lot of the data that was provided enabled us to develop a baseline forecast and do a lot of the segmentation and background analysis on this study. I was reviewing a similar potential study from a neighboring state, and was just really struck struck by the level of participation that has been taking place in Wisconsin, not only in support of the focus programs, but on this EE potential study. And our team's especially grateful for all those contributions, without which the study wouldn't carry as much meaning as it does by having that level of data. So I'll begin by just giving a brief recap of methodology. I know we've covered this in some detail previously, but just to set the stage and serve as a reminder for folks who may have not been able to make all the stakeholder calls, just wanted to walk us through briefly the types of potential that the Cadmus team has estimated for the EE potential study. This is a fairly standard chart in the sense that it shows different levels of energy efficiency potential, beginning with the highest level, technical, and then economic. And then for the focus on energy potential study, we've also estimated two additional levels of potential that we'll be referring to as optimized and current policy. And then there at the bottom, just a disclaimer, the potential study does not, this potential study does not provide program targets. We don't estimate program potential and try to assess what each individual program should accomplish in the future. But rather, those program targets are obviously developed through the more comprehensive quad planning process that Mitch outlined earlier. Just briefly, definitionally, a reminder that technical potential represents the theoretical maximum energy that can be displaced by efficiency. And then we screen individual measures for cost effectiveness using the current PSC approved economic screening test in Wisconsin to determine that portion of technical potential that is economic. And then again, for this study, the two flavors that we'll be focusing on later in the presentation, optimized and current policy potential. Optimized potential accounts for real-world barriers to adoption and non-measure costs of delivering programs. And then current policy will serve as a subset of the optimized potential, with the primary difference between the two being that current policy has an additional constraint placed on it based on current estimates of the focus on energy efficiency, budget, and balance of ratepayer funding. So again, optimized potential, no funding constraints. Current policy potential does have funding constraints. Jeremy gave us a quick preview earlier of the draft report that stakeholders will be able to review starting in June. And just a quick reminder that our primary reporting will be around those two levels of potential that I talked about most recently. Optimized potential, again, this is cost-effective EE savings without implementation constraints. And it's analogous to the maximum achievable potential from 2017, though there are some obvious variations we'll get into later. And then current policy potential, a subset of the optimized potential, will be constrained by annual budget amounts. So those two levels of potential serve as the core scenarios that we'll be reporting over the 12-year study horizon, with a particular emphasis on the first 4 years, otherwise known as Quad 4, beginning in 2023. In addition to the core scenarios, our team, in consultation with the stakeholders and with the PSC, have also performed a number of different scenario analyses whereby we have altered either input variables or assumptions, including things like discount rates, avoided cost forecasts, avoided carbon prices, differing assumptions around funding levels for focus on energy, and some sensitivities around the timing for the Energy Information Security Independence Act that was originally passed in 2007 and had set federal minimum standards for screw-based lighting, first beginning in 2011 or 2012, and then most recently it was supposed to have been implemented in 2020, but we'll get into the more details about that particular scenario later. Slide 10, I just want to give a brief methodology overview, and we lay it out here in sort of a linear format, and we start really with one of the data items that we've requested from utilities, which is a sales forecast. So the study looks at both electric energy efficiency as well as natural gas energy efficiency. And we really begin with a baseline forecast that is absent future planned energy efficiency. We collect data both through surveys and some virtual site visits, rely on existing primary data. And we use a lot of that information to do two things. First is to inform our load disaggregation. CADMAS does use an end-use potential study model. And so we do need estimates of sales by both sector and market segment and consumptions by end use. We also use data collection to inform measure characterization, which really sort of serves as the primary locus through which we estimate potential. As part of the measure characterization process, we develop estimates of baseline in-use consumption by sector and market segment, And these are pretty granular estimates of usage, not only looking at end uses themselves, but also various efficiency levels within those end uses. The measure characterization also obviously characterizes all of the energy efficiency technologies, including things like annual energy savings, peak demand savings, the incremental costs of those technologies, measure lives, and any applicability factors that are required to estimate potential. Through data collection and measure characterization, we also develop technology characteristics. So looking at not only those savings, but also for end uses where there are options for fuel choice. We look at the shares of those fuel choices, the saturation of those end uses, and any feasibility constraints. Not every measure can be installed in every application, and our methodology accounts for that. And then we also consider interactions. So interactions between measures and between end uses over time that may reduce individual savings measures as the building stock or housing stock becomes more efficient. We then take all that information and first develop a technical potential forecast, and the difference between the initial load forecast and the technical potential forecast represents technical potential. Again, there the only limitation is our technical feasibility constraints. For example, something like a heat pump water heater. There are many wonderful applications for heat pump water heaters, but there are some building segments for which heat pump water heaters aren't a great fit, and so we adjust things like technical feasibility there. Once we've estimated technical potential, then we use a combination of load shapes and avoided cost benefits and measure cost to estimate economic potential. And then after estimating economic potential, we then move on to optimize potential. Later on in the presentation, I'll spend a little more time talking about the other primary potential type that we'll be reporting. That's the current policy potential. And I'll dig into a little bit of more of the methodology behind the current policy potential when we arrive there. We've covered this overview already, but do need to spend a little more time on current policy when we get there later in the presentation. All right, so I'm just doing a quick check to see if we had any questions. Looks like we're good to go. So I will walk us through the technical potential draft results starting now. We're on slide 12, and I'll give an overview of this slide, and then we'll see some more slides throughout the presentation that look like this one. But the very first slide presents the draft sector level final year baseline sales. And so, as I mentioned, we really the first starting point within our study is to develop a baseline sales forecast. And so this slide shows the comparison of the final year in the 2021 study compared to the 2017 study there at the top of the slide. And we can see that in between the two vintages of studies, the difference in the 4 years and the final year of the study forecast period, growth of around a little over 3,000 gigawatt hours. And then in the figure below that, just a quick walkthrough. Here we've listed each of the different sectors and their contributions to the baseline forecast in gigawatt hours. And so looking at single family as an example, there's 2 bars there, and on the left hand side where it says 18,022, the green portion of that bar that goes all the way up to the top represents the final year baseline sales. And then the gold portion of that total bar represents the income qualified portion of the single family final year baseline sales. And then the bar immediately to its right is from the 2017 study, where we see the gray area representing the total, and then that black portion of the bar representing the income qualified portion of the final year sales from the 2017 study. Similar color coding for multifamily. But of course, when we move to commercial, government, industrial, and the agricultural sector, we're obviously not looking at income qualified customers, as they really just pertain to the residential sector. But you can see the comparison between the final year baseline forecast sales in the 2021 study and the 2017 study, and see where things have shifted a bit. Most notably in the industrial sector on the electric side of the equation. Slide 13 is almost identical in terms of its layout to the previous slide, except now we're moving from electric baseline sales to natural gas. So again, at the top, a comparison between the 2017 study and the 2021 study in terms of the baseline sales. And then within the figure itself, we have the sales by sector. You can see the change from one study vintage to the next. And then you can also see the income qualified portions of the natural gas sales within the single family and multifamily sector. And so staying consistent with that theme, slide 14 moves us away from baseline sales forecast and into the actual draft sector level technical potential results. And so similarly, the color scheme should follow what was on the previous slide, but now the bars represent on the vertical axis the total 12-year gigawatt hours of technical potential on a cumulative basis, and then the percentages represent those savings as a percentage of the final year baseline sales. And again, we have not only the values from the 2021 study, but also the previous study there on a comparative basis. In the upper right-hand corner of slide 14, just want to point out there in the green box where it says 12-year cumulative technical potential relative to baseline. Relative to baseline sales forecast, we do see a slight increase in the overall potential between the two studies. And then just below that box, a few of the key changes. And I'll walk through those briefly. So one change was that particularly within the residential sector, we updated assumptions around fuel share saturations with 2020 survey data. And for water heating and space heating end uses, we did see a bit of a shift compared to what we saw in 2017 from gas fuel shares to electric. And so we're seeing a bit more potential as a result of that shift. The next two bullet items in terms of key changes, updated timing of the commercial screw-based lighting phase out, and updated phase out and timing of the LED saturation of residential lighting. So these are slightly complex in the sense that we have updated not only the saturation of LED lighting in uses for both the residential and commercial sectors, but when we did the study in 2017, at the time, there was still the expectation that the ISA backstop standard for screw-based LED lighting would go into effect in 2020. And of course, it turns out that in the intervening years, that in fact did not occur. And so that baseline change from a federal minimum efficiency standard point of view didn't take place. And as a result, within this study, we did not assume that the ISO 2020 backstop standard went into effect. In fact, currently there is no standard on the books, but we have run some sensitivities around that general screw-based end use, and when we think, when we think the baseline may shift in a permanent sense. And so right now we're assuming different points in time for both general screw-based lighting as well as specialty lighting. And I'll show much later, or a little bit later in the presentation, some results around that sensitivity in that scenario that we ran. And then another key change, just to point out, is that within the 2021 study, we've updated industrial data sources and end-use savings percentages to align with recent program achievements. So a couple of fairly late-breaking changes for anyone who follows the work that the Energy Information Administration does in its surveys. In the 2018 MEX or Manufacturing Energy Consumption Survey, data was made available publicly in February of this year. We were anticipating that, and we were able to use that information to help update assumptions around end-use consumption within the industrial sector. And then our team spent quite a bit of time realigning assumptions that we had, particularly with respect to industrial process savings measures. And so we do see an increase in the technical potential within the industrial sector. In terms of slide 15 presents the draft sector level gas technical potential. Again, the percentages there and on the bars represent the 12-year cumulative technical potential as a percentage of final year baseline sales. And then you can see the values on the vertical axis represent the savings in thousands of therms. Again, we have it sector by sector. And also we have, we're showing for the single family and multifamily sectors, the proportion of savings that come from income qualified segment. On the upper right-hand corner, we do see a slight decrease in the technical potential for natural gas between the 2017 study and the 2021 study. Key changes here for gas include, again, some updated fuel share and saturation data based on the more recent surveys that we conducted in 2020. And then some primary data collection found, slightly lower fuel shares of natural gas, heating equipment in the commercial and government sectors compared to the previous study. And that's reflected in the minor change there in the commercial technical potential. And again, we did update industrial data sources using mixed data as well as other information that we collected based on program history and improved some of the outlier screening for the industrial data, survey data that we had incorporated into the potential estimates. So overall, a slight decrease in technical potential on the gas side and a slight increase in technical potential on the electric side. I'm going to take a sip of water and pause here and see if there are any questions before we move into the economic potential results. All right. So with that, we'll move right into the economic potential results. Again, these slides are going to start to feel like second nature here in a minute. We see on slide 18 where we've presented the draft sector level electric economic potential. We see that the colors and the layout are very similar to the technical potential slides. Again, the percentages indicate 12-year cumulative economic potential as a percentage of the final year baseline sales. The green bars from 2021, the gold portion of the single family and multifamily sector represents income qualified customers. And then the bars to the right-hand side represent results from 2017. So in total, on the upper right-hand side, we see that the level of economic potential relative to baseline sales between the two studies is really quite consistent. We noted in the previous section that technical potential has increased. That alone doesn't lead to an increase in economic potential. We see that if we look at the second box where it shows the proportion of 12-year technical potential that is economic, we actually see a slight decrease. So in 2017, you know, the amount of economic potential that was estimated represented 83% of the technical potential. In 2021, we see that's lower to 77%. And the primary reason for that is that avoided energy costs that we are using in the study that have been approved by the PSC and are used for evaluating cost effectiveness for focused programs in Quad 3 are 30% lower than the avoided energy costs that were used in the 2017 study. So that factor alone would contribute to lower economic potential, but it's sort of offset by the fact that we saw an increase in the technical potential from the previous section. Just a couple of other brief notes to make here. I did want to point out that if we look at the single family and multifamily sectors, that the income qualified portion accounts for just shy of 40% of the single family economic potential and just shy of half of the multifamily economic potential. And then again, we do see a relatively substantial increase in the amount of industrial savings in terms of economic potential between this study and the last, as a result of some of the updates that we made that I described previously. Slide 19 shifts us from the electric back over to natural gas. Again, with that, a change in colors. The slide looks very similar to what we looked at on the technical potential side. Again, the percentages indicate cumulative economic potential as a percentage of final year baseline sales. We see that for each of the sectors, and then for single family and multifamily, the proportion that's represented by income qualified customers. In the upper right-hand corner, we'll note that the 12-year cumulative economic potential relative to baseline has dropped from 20% to 16%, and then the proportion of the 12-year proportion of 12-year technical potential that is economic has also dropped. Again, key changes. Avoided energy costs are about 30% lower for natural gas than they were in 2017. And that alone, again, results in fewer measures being cost effective. And our subsequent analysis found that there were a number of measures with relatively large savings on the technical potential side that are just below the border of being cost effectiveness on the economic side. And so gas is somewhat different than electric in the sense that there are fewer end uses, there are fewer measures, and so changes to a smaller subset of measures can create bigger changes in terms of the overall amount of potential. And so in our review of the draft results, we did want to just spend a few seconds describing some of the measures that we found that were borderline cost effective in both the electric and natural gas portions of the study. And we've identified these and labeled them borderline, but just wanted to be clear that these are measures with a modified TRC ratio of less than 1, but greater than 0.75. And I'll go on further to say that for some of these, just because it says here that they're not cost effective, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not cost effective in every application. Our team undergoes a very thorough segmentation process, and we look at measures in individual applications, not only by residential housing type, but also by commercial building type. And so some of these measures may be cost effective in some commercial building types, but not others. Just want to briefly mention on the electric side, a few measures with healthy contributions to technical potential that did not pass the economic screen include residential TLED fluorescent lamps, advanced entertainment power strips, and then commercial advanced rooftop controllers and commercial floating head pressure controls. And then on the natural gas side, we have a mix of insulation, thermal envelope measures in the residential sector, and then various controls and commissioning on the commercial side of the equation. So that brings us to the end of the economic results potential section. I'm going to pause again and see if there are any questions. All right. Please don't be shy. I don't see any yet in the chat. If anyone has questions, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask, or feel free, if you don't feel comfortable asking in front of everyone, feel free to include your question in the chat. Right. So next on slide 22, thus far we provided a methodology overview.
Lakin, you did have a question come in.
Okay, great.
From Aaron.
Hi, this is Erin. Yeah, I was just kind of curious when you went back to that economic potential. That's net economic potential, correct?
When you say net,
Well,
Erin?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Is it the modified TRC that gets applied here?
It is the modified TRC test, yes.
Okay, so then that would take out, that does account for then like attribution and net to gross?
No, I would consider these savings gross savings. We haven't
Okay.
applied any assumptions about free ridership or, evaluation realization rates to measures that have deemed savings or engineered estimates of savings. And so really, when we use the MTRC and we calculate the benefits, we're looking at the present value of the avoided energy and on the electric side, avoided generation capacity benefits. And we'll get into that. I can provide more detail about this later, but we also obviously look at the avoided carbon emissions on the benefits side. And then when we look at the individual savings, we're not making any adjustments to future savings based on any assumptions about either free ridership or future evaluated realization rates. So they're gross savings.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
No problem, and thank you for your question. All right. So next, just as a reminder, at this point we've done a bit of a methodological overview, presented technical potential results and economic potential. And before we go into the optimized and current policy, wanted to spend a little time walking through the process that we use to assign ramp rates and some of the results of that process. Because we last met, I believe Mitch said in November, which is hard to believe, and then subsequently there was a lot of folks graciously volunteered their time to review our assumptions to help inform estimates and improve estimates of optimized potential. And so we really wanted to take a little time to just kind of provide a little bit more context for everyone about how that process worked. And so slide 23 just provides an overview of the process. Again, that the first step was that our team assigned potential study measures to specific groups. We reviewed available market data and historical program performance data, and then we made initial assignments of these ramp rates based on that review and summary of those data. In step two, we asked experts to review these assigned technology groups and then reviewed our preliminary assignments and provide their feedback on the reasonableness and appropriateness and suggest changes to us if they felt changes were warranted. And then in step three, we reviewed all that feedback. We summarized those comments and then those recommended changes and in some instances, other suggestions. And then in the intervening time, we consulted with PSC staff on the proposed changes to preliminary ramp rates based on that expert input. And so Just to provide a bit of a report out, slide 24 shows on the vertical axis the number of measure groups by major sectors, and then we sort of got this color coding here that describes the percent of those measure groups that had varying numbers of stakeholders responding to our request to review ramp rate assignments. And so it was a lot of data. It was very detailed and pretty technical. And we got, I think we were all really pleased and really grateful for the feedback we got. Just noting here, we requested it from 31 different experts and we received feedback from 25. So a pretty astonishing rate. And then these experts were identified based on experience in the industry and then their knowledge of the technology subgroups. Ultimately, after we reviewed the feedback, we had to make decisions regarding those ramp rates, whether to leave them alone or to increase the speed of the ramp rate or decrease the speed of the ramp rate. And so slide 25 provides instances where, based on that feedback, where we made changes. And so on the left-hand side, it just shows where we had consensus among, among reviewers regarding their input about the pace of adoption for these various technology categories. And so for everything that's listed on the left-hand side, we increase the speed of the ramp rate. And then the items listed on the right-hand side, we decrease the speed of the ramp rate. And so there were no major changes and no, just one other thing I'll point out with regard to the retrofit measures, changing the acquisition rate doesn't necessarily affect the overall amount of potential that's available. It just changes the rate at which it would be acquired. And so it could have an effect to either increase slightly or decrease slightly the amount of potential that's assumed to occur in a quad 4 in the first 4 years of the study. For replacement or equipment burnout measures, natural replacement measures, sometimes what we refer to as lost opportunity, increased ramp rates would increase the potential somewhat, since it would increase the amount of adoption on an annual basis, whereas decreased ramp rates would decrease the optimized potential a little bit. Again, for the same reason, lost opportunity ramp rates assume that each percentage in each year corresponds to the amount of adoption of that technology in a specific year. So that was our summary of the process and some of the outcomes. I'll pause there on slide 26 just to see if anyone has any more questions about the ramp rate review process, how we collated that information, and how we use that information to inform estimates of potential.
We did have a question from Kathy. And Kathy, I can read this out, or if you want to unmute yourself and speak, that's fine.
Can you hear me? Does this?
I can
hear you.
Okay. It just struck me as, I don't know that it's really a question. It's just an observation that we're decreasing the ramp rate on so many HVAC measures when historically those have been the measures that transitioned the quickest in Wisconsin. I just feel like I should say that out loud to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for your feedback, Kathy, and to the remaining part of the question that you had in the chat box. I think we definitely can include that level of detail in the appendix, and I think that maybe the best way to do that is just to note sort of what the initial ramp rate assignment was and what it was changed to. I don't remember off the top of my head what those were for furnaces and some of the other HVAC measures. But I definitely think we can make that information available and those data available in the appendices when we discuss how we estimated optimized potential. All right, any other questions about the ramp rate process? Okay, so just doing a quick time check here. I've got 150. And so in the next section, section 5, we present the optimized and current policy potential draft results. Slide 28, again, shows the draft sector level electric optimized potential. Just as a quick reminder, the optimized potential is a subset of the economic, and this is the potential that was informed by changes to our methodology between the 2017 study and the 2021 study, whereby we decided to not use willingness to pay surveys as a primary function for estimating this level of potential, but instead used a more deterministic approach to determining maximum achievability over time, and then assigning ramp rates and doing stakeholder review of those ramp rates to determine the rate of acquisition in the intervening years. And so just want to highlight here a few things. Again, the percentages indicate 12-year cumulative optimized potential as a percent of final year baseline sales. And the gray bars from 2017 represent a maximum incentive achievable scenario methodology. And that's not perfectly aligned with how we estimated the optimized potential in this study, but it's the best analogy that we have between the two studies. And so in 2017, the way that we estimated max achievable was by a willingness to pay survey, and we determined that maximum amount of economic potential that would be achievable based on customer responses to prompts about whether or not they would adopt efficiency measures given a certain incentive payment. And under the max achievable scenario, that incentive amount was equal to 100% of the incremental cost. And so within this figure, we can see that on a percentage basis, for each of this, for most of the sectors, we see either comparable results or an increase in the amount of potential, optimized potential relative to maximum achievable in 2017. And so just walking through these a little bit in a little bit more detail. For example, in the single family sector, we see that the optimized potential would equate to about 3,750 gigawatt hours, or approximately 21% of the 12-year baseline forecast sales. So that does represent a really healthy level of potential. And then you see, again, in the multifamily sector, about 14% of sales, commercials 14%, government 13%. And then again, a pretty large increase there in industrial potential, 16% of sales, looking at the optimized potential, cumulative 12-year values as a percent of the baseline forecast. Just a few other things to note here. In the first 4 years of the study, so first 4 years of the 12-year study, the cumulative optimized potential accounts for about 38% of the total 12-year potential. And so the potential is somewhat front-loaded into the first 4 years, but not to some huge amount. The first 4 years represents a third of the 12-year study. And here we're saying that optimized about 38% of the optimized potential can be captured in the first 4 years. In terms of the average annual potential, so if we just looked at the total 12-year timeline and took a straight average of the gigawatt hours, we'd see that on an average annual basis, it's just shy of 1,000 gigawatt hours. And that represents, again, a really healthy amount of savings. 17% of the total 12-year cumulative potential of the baseline sales forecast is quite a healthy amount. The other thing I'll point out is that for the optimized potential, it's not constrained by the amount of available budget to the programs, but because in the next phase we did estimate current policy potential, we did estimate what the average annual budget for optimized potential would look like based on recent focus program experience. And we see that on an average annual basis, the electric potential has a budget of about, optimized potential has a budget of about $90 million. And so we arrived at that amount by looking at incentive amounts based on current incentive amounts at the measure level, creating proxies where we had to, and then also looking at various administrative costs based on about the level they are today, and then sort of taking the potential and building those annual budgets from the bottom up. So just to give you a sense of what we think this level of potential would cost, we think it's about $90 million a year on an average annual basis, just for the electric potential. Slide 29 shows this similar view as the previous slide, but again, switching from electric potential to natural gas. In the top right-hand corner, again, making this analogy between 2021 optimized potential and 2017 max achievable. It's not a perfect comparison, but it is the best analogy we have. And we do see a relatively substantial drop in the amount of natural gas potential. Again, a lot of this is influenced by upstream. When we estimate economic potential with much lower avoided costs, we did see a decrease in the economic potential as well. And so here you can see in these portions of the figure, these percentages, savings as a percent of baseline sales, and where they've decreased pretty much across the board on a sector by sector basis for natural gas. Compared with the electric savings potential, where we had 38% of the 12-year cumulative draft optimized potential in the first 4 years, here on the gas side, it's 34. We went through a similar budget exercise, building a bottom-up budget for the optimized potential, and we arrived at a value of approximately $47 million on an average annual basis. And so that's quite a bit, and it equates to just over 30,000 therms of potential savings on an average annual basis for the gas optimized potential. So that covers the optimized potential. We've got some slides that I mentioned earlier to describe how we calculated the current policy potential. And so wanted to just briefly provide an overview of how we generated these estimates and the steps that we took. And so step one, described a little bit already briefly, but really the first step before we even estimated current policy potential was to develop annual optimized potential and its associated incentive and administrative budgets. And then we aggregated that optimized potential budgets based on the different sectors and fuel types. And so for each of the sectors here in electric, in each of the fuel types, both electric and gas, for each of these levels of optimized potential, we had a corresponding amount of estimated budget that optimized potential represents. And that was our second step. And then in the third step, we looked at in 4-year and 12-year increments, we looked at the current policy budgets by sector and fuel type. And so over 4 years and over 12 years, based on today's level of funding of focus program budgets, what are the total amounts over 4 years? What are the total amounts over 12 years? And then to get from optimized potential to current policy potential, we had to apply, ratios to the optimized potential by fuel type and by sector, so that in years 1 through 4, the total 4-year budget did not exceed the current policy 4-year budget by sector and fuel type. And then in years 5 through 12, we applied another ratio to optimize potential so that the 12-year budget did not exceed the current policy 12-year budget, and the 4-year budget was still maintained at its current funding level. And so to provide a bit more detail around those funding constraints, these were some of the assumptions we made, beginning at the top, that an average annual budget was around almost $87.5 million. For those astute followers of the Focus on Energy overall budget, we did have a couple of exclusions. So we did exclude the proportion of the total annual budget that goes to renewables. And then we did exclude portions of administrative costs that are not directly related to implementation contracts. And that includes things like the PSC staff salaries, or the evaluation budget, or the fiscal agent budget. And so really what we're trying to arrive at in the current policy funding scenario is what amount is available on an average annual basis for direct acquisition in terms of, not only incentive payments, but also the administrative costs related to implementation and running the programs. The next level of funding constraints that we had was a fuel split. And so we assumed, in those 4-year and that 12-year funding constraints, that approximately 70% of the average annual budget would be available to fund electric programs, and then the remaining 30% for natural gas. And then finally, the last level of funding constraints is that we looked at by fuel type what percentages of the fuel type budgets could be applied to the different sectors. And so residential represented about 40% of those fuel specific budgets, and then non-residential represented 60%, with a further delineation between the proportion of the non-residential budget that supports public and ag programs, and then commercial and industrial separately. So this just sort of describes each of the different constraints we had to consider when trying to determine the amount of current policy potential based on today's understanding of Focus on Energy program budgets. And so slide 32 shows the results at a draft, the draft results at the sector level electric current policy potential. In the upper right-hand corner, we see that in aggregate for the electric portion, the draft current policy potential represents about 13% of the cumulative potential relative to baseline sales. Again, because we've changed the way in which we estimate the potential for this relative to the 2017 study. It's not a perfect analogy, but we have compared it here to the business as usual achievable potential from 2017, and we do see there quite a big difference between 9% in that study and then 13% in this study. We will also note on the right-hand side, almost exactly a third of the 12-year cumulative draft current policy potential is available in the first 4 years of the study. If you look at that average annual budget based on all the different constraints we talked about, on the electric side, it's just north of $60 million, about $61 million on an average annual basis. And the average annual potential is just shy of 700 gigawatt hours. And then in the figure, you can see sector by sector what those savings amount represent in terms of gigawatt hours as well as savings as a percent of sales. Slide 33 shows similar results for natural gas. Again, making a comparison between the draft current policy potential results to the achievable business as usual from 2017. We do see a decrease in natural gas results. Similar to electric, just about a third of the 12-year cumulative current policy potential occurs in the first 4 years of the study. 17,500 therms on an average annual basis, and an average annual budget of around $25 million. And then you can see in the figure where the percents have changed by each of the sectors. Again, comparing draft current policy potential in the current study to the business as usual in the previous study. Some of the biggest changes include potential in the single family sector, and a little bit, a smaller change overall, but also the government and multifamily. Slide 34, just to place these results, the current policy results and the optimized potential results in context. We created some figures that take the cumulative 12-year potential and annualize, converts it to an annual basis, savings as a percent of sales, and then compares that savings as a percent of baseline sales to results from the previous 5 years beginning in 2019. And so I think this is a really handy way of looking at it and looking at the results. And so looking at electric, we see that, the optimized potential is just north of 1.5% savings, as 1.5% of baseline sales on an annual basis. And then current policy is just north of 1%. And so you can see there, the difference between optimized, where we don't have a funding constraint, and then current policy, where we do have a funding constraint. And then you can see where historical results, at least in the last 5 years, have landed between 0.87% and 1.13%. And then for natural gas, again, we do see a pretty large difference between the optimized potential that's annualized savings as percent of sales is 1.2. Current policy is 0.67 or just shy of 0.7. And then you can see those in context relative to historical savings as a percent of sales coming through the focus programs over the course of the last 5 years. So that brings us to the end of the section on optimized potential and current policy potential. I recognize that was a lot of information, and I'll pause there and just note, now that I'm looking, I see a number of questions. So I guess we can start. Jeremy, do you mind helping me out here and walking through these questions?
Sure. So we had a couple from Kathy when you were still talking on optimized potential, and I think maybe the first one was answered with the slide that you just showed. And
Okay.
Kathy, I see you unmuted yourself. If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I was there. I guess part of my feedback on this is I appreciate the need to compare things to 2017, but 2017 is so different. I would like to see some. By the time we get to the end here, I'm trying to remember what the technical potential was as a % of sales, and that was, it would be useful to see for a sector for 2021, the technical, the economic, the optimized sort of pieces of that. And partly why I suggest that is when you got to the optimized, I started thinking about the kinds of climate goals we're talking about for energy efficiency in the state. And that's more like 2% of electric usage reductions a year. And so it's interesting to me that we don't have, that the optimized here is 1.5%. And I think we'll want to think about that. So I'm not sure there's anything there, except that it would be, for me, really useful to see that technical down to current policy in a single graph for a sector, just to understand how that moves. I'm also, the budget piece of this, I end up with a couple of questions about. The first is that it seems to me as we increase savings, we're achieving things that are harder to achieve. And so I guess I'm not convinced that budget piece is as linear as it seemed like in the way you described it. And I guess I would just hope there's some conversation with Aptum about how that's not linear, because I think it's not linear. And then thinking forward about that average budget, all of these years of low natural gas prices are now in the numbers that determine the focused budget. So my gut is that the current focused budget isn't a good estimate of the future focused budget, that we may actually be looking at that revenue going down a bit more. And again, Aptum would have a better sense of that than me. But so those are the pieces that struck me in that.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And I think to your first point, that is very helpful. Your suggestion, as I understand it, was, hey, what may improve our understanding of the potential is, let's see a figure that, instead of maybe showing history like we have here, well, history is cool, but I think what you're saying is, for each sector, like, show the full gamut: technical, economic, optimized, current policy, annualized savings as a % of sales. And so I just wanted to respond and say, we're smack dab in the middle of trying to get a report ready, for the PSC to review, and then for stakeholders to review. And so I'll just make that commitment on behalf of, our team, and say, I agree with your suggestion. I think that would make for a really compelling figure. And we'll work to find the right place to incorporate that in the draft report, because I think it packs in a lot of really good information. And on your budget questions, in terms of sort of what we saw. Let me back up here. I get so excited talking about this. In terms of what we saw, on an average annual budget here of $90 million, and then how we apply ratios to get to, a current policy of around $60 million. I don't disagree with you that, maybe that increment between 60 million and $90 million isn't entirely a linear acquisition curve. I will say that, all those savings are economic, and we didn't do any sort of optimization, right? Like, we didn't take all the potential and sort it by its benefits or by its savings. We just applied, broad ratios. And so at least, from a modeling sort of theory standpoint, those savings do have a similar level of acquisition costs. But I agree with you. I think if programs do scale, were to scale to the degree in which you're describing, there may be, that acquisition cost may rise as well. But I want to be clear, like, we didn't make any sort of assumptions about that in the optimized potential budgets we calculated from the bottom up, nor how we got to the current policy budgets.
And can I just jump in there? Because as you're saying, that's really helpful, Lakin. And as I'm thinking about this, one of the things that always made me really uncomfortable with the last potential study was the way that it said focus could accomplish, if we doubled the focus budget, savings would go up by 50%, which to me seemed like a terrible headline. In this case, you're saying if the budget went up by 50%, savings would go up by about 50%. And so as an advocate, I much prefer the headline that's evolving here than the one that we had from the last potential study. So maybe as long as you're really clear about how you're doing that, and you're right, you're not picking measures, so it's not necessarily the case that those next ones are that much more expensive. I mean, the Aptum people may have some opinions there, but the longer I think about this, the more I like it, even though I wish we could be showing something more like 2% electric savings here. I'm concerned that we're not yet at that level, but 4 years from now, Kathy.
Thanks, Kathy. We do in the next section look at a scenario that is a doubling of, looks at different funding scenarios. And so I'm not going to make the argument now that says, I don't think we can make the argument that says, increasing the budget, 50% from the 60 million to what we had for the optimized, by 50%, equals an increase in potential of 50%. Again, we built this optimized potential from the bottom up, absent any funding constraints. And so it's totally, unconstrained in that sense. Current policy is constrained. And I think when we look at the funding scenarios that we'll get to here in a few minutes, we'll want to revisit this discussion in a little bit more detail. So yeah, more to come on that. But I wanted to, before we get there, Jeremy, see if there were any other questions.
Sure. There was a question from Aaron, and it was pertaining to current policy potential.
Okay.
And again, curious if net to gross was included in the estimates. And Aaron, please feel free to jump in.
And thank you. Yeah. And if it's never included, that's fine. I'm just, I'm just wondering, because that is a big factor in program design, especially when we're looking across measures, is sort of what is our net to gross looking like? And we might, design programs in a different way. If that's not a part of the potential study, that's fine. I'm just curious.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Aaron. And it's not. We did not apply, any assumptions about, future free riders or future, realization rates from evaluations to the potential study forecast that we see here. So to be clear, it does not. These would represent gross savings. There is no adjustment for net.
So then there probably needs to be, when this goes from potential study to a savings target through quad planning process, there probably needs to be some consideration of that too. But that sounds like it's the next step after this.
I would assume so. Yes. I'll leave that to the folks who'll be involved in the quad planning process. But yeah, in terms of the potential study, we didn't make adjustments to potential for net to gross.
Hey, Aaron, this is Mitch. I'll just say absolutely that will happen.
Thanks.
And then one more question from Scott Blankman, and he was asking to elaborate about the kind of some of the key changes that went into income qualified potential between the two studies and how those influenced some of the changes that we're seeing. I think just across the board, I'm not sure if it's about any specific level of potential.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think I'm just looking at my notes here, and so I'll provide a little bit more color to the extent that I can. And then if there's anything that I'm not able to describe or answer right now, we're obviously happy to take feedback in any form, phone call, short meeting, email, if you feel like there's something that should be addressed in the report. But just looking at as an example on slide 28, the single family potential and the multifamily potential in the electric, for electric, the income qualified in single family represents about 45% of the optimized potential. In multifamily, it's about half. And so in terms of changes from, one study to the next study, the way that we can characterize those changes take a couple of forms. And so first, broadly, things that would affect income qualified customers and not income qualified customers equally are things like, the avoided cost forecast, methodological changes that apply to both, right? Like we didn't do willingness to pay surveys. We didn't assume different ramp rates at a segment level. So those assumptions, a lot of assumptions are applied to both groups equally. What may change between studies for income qualified customers would be things like, per unit savings for individual measures. Is there more information that we can use there? What about the costs of replacing those measures? And then probably most importantly, the one thing that has changed between the two studies, underlying data sources that we use to estimate, what portion of that residential customer population is income qualified. And in the 2017 study, we were using older data. And in this study, we've updated that, and we're using census data. I believe, don't quote me on this, it will be in the report, but I think it's the 2019 American Community Survey data set. It would be a five-year data set for Wisconsin. And so we do see, when we look at the income levels that we determine for income qualified, they're based on the number of occupants per home. And so we do see, between the two studies, a relative decrease in the proportion of residential customers that are income qualified. But as you see here in optimized potential, it's actually the values probably increased a little bit, just due to some of the assumptions we made about individual measure assumptions. So, for example, like the lighting standard not going into effect, would increase potential this time compared to last time where we assumed it would go into effect, and things of that nature. So hopefully that my rambling response is helpful, Scott. But if there's anything else you had questions about, please don't hesitate to ask us. All right. I'm just doing a quick time check. It's almost 2:30, so 2:25. And we've made it through optimized potential and current policy potential. And we are now looking at the scenario draft results. And so I'll preface this by saying we've got a number of different scenarios that we considered, and we'll walk through each of these. And so please, again, don't hesitate to write your questions in the chat, or to unmute yourself and speak up when you're ready to ask the questions. But previous slide, I think early on we illustrated that we considered a number of different scenarios, and really just as an overall reminder, the importance and purpose of these scenarios is to help provide information when it does come to the quad planning process. The technical potential, economic, optimized, current policy, all of those potential estimates are using a common set of base scenario assumptions that are, based on what's applicable today, particularly with respect to the modified TRC tests. And so we've looked at a number of different scenarios to help provide additional information, regarding what may happen or what we may expect to see happen if we were to change some of those assumptions. And so we're gonna lead here with the funding scenarios. Again, as we've already described, the current policy potential on an average annual basis is north of $87 million. And so we looked at 2 additional funding scenarios, including a 50% funding increase and a 100% funding increase. And you see the corresponding average annual budgets there below. Again, just the efficiency portion of the budget, excluding renewables, excluding evaluation, fiscal agent, and PSC salaries. And so slide 38 first looks at the results from the electric focus funding scenario. And if you look at the primary figure there, we have the 12-year current policy potential, and we show that it's over 8,000 gigawatt hours, and as a proportion of the optimized potential, it's about 70%. And then we look at increasing funding by 50%, and we see that the results are about 11,200 gigawatt hours. And so we see that in the box on the left-hand side, an increase in funding of 50% is equal to an increase in savings of about 35%. And then on the right-hand side, about 12,500 gigawatt hours, looking at the 100% funding scenario. And then again, looking at the 2 boxes below, we see that the 100% funding scenario increases the potential relative to the current policy by about 50%. And then in the lower right-hand box, annual savings as a percent of sales, we see, again, current policies around 1%. The 50% scenario is around 1.44, and then the 100% funding scenario is over 1.6%. And so, this sort of immediately harkens questions about how we arrived at these estimates, relative to the slides that we just reviewed for optimized potential and current policy potential. And, Kathy asked, or pointed out in the previous section, when we looked at the optimized potential, we're seeing 17% savings as equal to 17% of sales at $90 million. And then we're seeing, 13% of sales at about $60 million. And so it seems to be that there's almost a disconnect, right? Just immediately looking at this. Here we're saying that under this 100% funding scenario increase, that the savings are going up by 50%. And so there is an explanation for that, and there are a couple things that are happening. And so, first in this funding scenario that we're presenting here, we have not relaxed any of the assumptions that we previously made with regard to how we're allocating the different funding amounts based on these constraints. And so invariably, what has happened here is that we get to a point where for some segments and some fuel type combinations, as you sort of move up the ladder in terms of potential, it does begin to get more expensive. And as a result, we see that, again, for some sector and fuel type combinations, that we may be, quote unquote, leaving potential on the table in the sense that because we have retained those funding constraints on a sector and fuel type basis, we're essentially saying like, hey, we've got to spend this amount of money in the commercial or non-residential sector. Meanwhile, there's more savings opportunity, in the residential sector that we're thereby not acquiring. And so, those combinations of factors, lead us to a result like this where we do see that, if we were to look at how we've ratioed down the potential in order to arrive at this funding scenario, that for some segment and fuel combinations, we do see savings that are not being attained or acquired due to the fact that we haven't relaxed any of the other constraints around, the allocation of funds to different sector and fuel type combinations. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions about how we did this analysis.
There is a question from Mark Kajorli in the chat, and it's about the 50% greater funding scenario, and if that includes or would include a recommendation to increase cap on large energy users. And Mark, feel free to elaborate if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, the cap right now for the large energy users, I believe, is $400,000 per year. And that does limit what us large energy users can take advantage of the program for. So there's opportunity over and above that, especially if we adopt one of these higher funding scenarios. So that's what I'm addressing.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mark. We didn't explicitly, model lifting any funding caps, and we are also not making any recommendations in the potential study about those funding caps and whether they should be lifted or not. We really just simply looked at when we increase the funding scenario, when we increase the amount of funding, what additional potential could we acquire, holding constant sort of our assumptions around, the levels of funding that we have to work with in terms of these different constraints. So if we, increase the budget by 50%, we're still assuming that 70% goes to electric, 30% goes to natural gas. And then in terms of the segment splits at the sector level, that 60 goes to non-residential and 40 goes to residential, but we're not making any other, explicit assumptions about caps for large energy users or anyone else. All right. So that shows the that's the electric funding scenarios for the showing the increase in funding of 50% and 100%. And then on the gas side again, we see somewhat similar results in the sense that when we increase the potential by 50%, we're seeing increase the funding by 50%, we're seeing an increase in potential of 22%. And then when we increase the funding by 100%, we're seeing an increase in potential of 32%. And then we see annual savings as a percent of sales there. On the right-hand side, current policy again is just shy of 0.7, 50% is an increase of 50% is around 0.8, and then 100% increase is around 0.9. Again, we've held sort of those funding constraints constant, not the overall amount, of course, but the amount that can be allocated to electric and gas, and then the amount that is available to each sector and fuel type combination. And we hold those constant again for some segments. We may not exhaust all the potential optimized potential or economic potential that's available, whereas for other segments, because of those funding constraints, we are acquiring more expensive funding, still cost effective, but maybe more expensive funding than what would be available from other sectors.
Lakin, can I jump in here? Because
Sure.
First, there's a math problem there on the screen, the 58 to 70, that's only an increase of 12%, not 22%, isn't it?
It's an increase in 12 percentage points. But if we look at it,
okay. Yep. Okay. So, but the difference between this and what we looked at a minute ago with the optimized, it does not make sense to me why this is this different than here. Go back to that historic one, this one. So here where the current policy versus the optimized annual savings, it's not intuitive. I'm still not getting why when you do that 50% increase in budget, you're seeing so little impact compared to what the optimized versus the current policy is here. I feel like I hear you saying, well, those are more complicated savings, but as long as you're under the optimized, they're not. They're part of the mix of everything that is in the optimized mix.
Right, and I think another way I can describe it is that when we look at the optimized potential and we have an average annual budget of around $90 million, and we have these savings coming from each of the different sectors, that we haven't applied any constraints to funding the acquisition of savings from each of these sectors at all, right? We've just looked at what's economic and the proportion of the economic potential that is optimized. But when we look at current policy, we then start applying, not only a total budget constraint, but we also apply constraints around where that money can go. And so,
okay, now I heard you. Okay, so when you talk about those budget levels, I would have a big ask that you make that really clear that this is increased funding with stringent parameters around which sectors that funding is spent in, because for the folks like Mark on the phone, and I know there are other advocates for industrial customers on the phone, we all benefit from those big industrial projects, and without a slightly less rigid constraints on the budget would mean substantially more savings with a 50% increase, because we wouldn't be turning away commercial and industrial savings to chase multifamily savings.
Yep. yeah, definitely understand your point, and I appreciate the feedback. And so kind of coming back here to this slide 38 and 39, just to recap, Kathy, your feedback is we need to be clear when we communicate that under these funding scenario increases, that we are not, relaxing or removing the constraints on, where that funding can go in terms of different different sector and fuel type combinations. And I'll reiterate, I hear you loud and clear. And if I didn't make that clear enough earlier, that's on us, and we'll make sure that we do so when we write the draft report.
And I appreciate that, Lake. And it's also that I have to sometimes hear things 3 times. I think part of my confusion is that when you have the dotted line there of the 12-year optimized, I mean, there are 2 different sets of rules happening in those 2 spots in the report, and I'm not sure quite how to make sure that it's totally clear to a reader, but I get it now.
Okay. All right, ditto on Kathy's comment. Thanks, Mark. We'll work and make sure that we make that abundantly clear. Again, we're in the middle. We're probably 80% of the way through the report right now, and so we'll draw a big circle around this and make sure that when it goes through PSC staff review, that we work with Mitch and others to make that abundantly clear, and then obviously when it goes out to stakeholders for review, we'll do that as well. All right, so in addition to the funding scenarios, we also looked at, a number of other scenarios, but sort of the first section is going through these alternate economic assumptions. And so on the left-hand side of slide 40, just a reminder that in our base analysis that we're using a discount rate of 2%, and then in the modified TRC cost effectiveness test, it does include the value of avoided carbon emissions, and that value currently is $15 per ton. And then it does exclude the benefits for deferred transmission and distribution that could occur due to energy efficiency programs and measures. And so we looked at a number of alternate scenarios, including looking at a 5% discount rate or a 0% discount rate. We also looked at a scenario where we used the social cost of carbon, which has a much higher economic value dollars per ton compared to what's currently being assumed. And then we also did a scenario where we looked at the benefits of deferred transmission and distribution, and you see that there, those vary between around $67 to $70 per kW year. Slide 41 just kind of takes all these different scenarios and stacks them up so that we're able to compare the economic potential relative to baseline sales. And so on the top figure, we have electric energy efficiency, and at the very bottom there, the base economic potential is equivalent to about 2% of sales on an average annual basis. And then you can see sort of how changing different assumptions affects the overall economic potential. So including deferred T&D increases it a little bit. Looking at the social cost of carbon increases it. The 0% discount rate will increase it a little bit, because if you're not discounting the present, discounting the future benefits in your present value calculation, those benefits will be higher. A higher discount rate, like in the 5% case, will reduce the potential because you're discounting those benefits more. And then we see some additional screens that we ran that we'll go through in more detail in the coming slides, including looking at the societal cost test as a variant, looking at utility cost test, and then looking at different cost effectiveness thresholds of 0.5 and 0.75. And of course, on the bottom portion of the screen, there's an analog for natural gas energy efficiency, where in the base scenario, economic potential relative to baseline sales is about 1.5%, and then you can see how the potential varies looking at each of the different scenarios. Slide 42 provides even more detail around the alternate economic assumption scenarios, including kind of different bar graphs that show the gigawatt hours of economic potential for each of those scenarios that I mentioned previously, and you can see what they represent on a 12-year basis as a percent of sales, and then also what the changes are, total changes are relative to the base scenario of economic potential. Slide 43 does the same, but instead of looking just at looking at electric, now it looks at natural gas. And so we're able to see that gas, relatively speaking, is a bit more sensitive to these changes in economic assumptions. Again, I think the primary reason for that is that when we looked at the initial results of gas economic potential, we noted that changes in avoided costs lowered the economic potential, and we had some large saving measures that were borderline cost effective. So by making small changes to these assumptions, we do see a lot more sensitivity on the gas side in terms of the overall amount of economic potential relative to those scenarios. Slide 44 presents some different alternate cost effectiveness screening scenarios. And so in addition to just altering economic inputs, we also ran a series of scenarios looking at different cost tests. Of course, the base being the modified TRC. We described a little bit already that the primary benefits there are avoided energy and carbon emissions. Doesn't include O&M, doesn't include any sort of, conservation adders, and cost effectiveness threshold is one. And then you can see we sort of go test by test, looked at the utility cost test, societal cost test, and then looking at differing thresholds for cost effectiveness, either 0.5 or 0.75. And then you can see sort of in the red will highlight where those changes were made. Slide 45 shows the results of the alternate cost effectiveness screening scenarios. And sort of unsurprisingly, we see that relative to the base scenario, economic potential is going to be most sensitive when you use a UCT cost screen. And the primary reason for that, you're essentially trading out in the cost column. You're essentially trading out, incremental customer costs for incentives, and because incentives are generally just a portion of the incremental cost, that really increases the cost effectiveness ratios for these measures. The benefits are going to be similar. You aren't going to have the avoided carbon, but those are outweighed by the reduction in costs and the utility cost test screen, and so we do see really sensitive results there, an increase in economic potential on the electric side of about 19% just by looking at the UCT. Slide 46, as I mentioned, again, gas potential is really sensitive to assumptions around cost effectiveness. Again, because we noted that in our base scenario, we had a number of large savings measures that were between 0.75 and 1.0 on MTRC. And so again, here, when we look at different cost test screens, we do see substantial changes in the economic potential from the societal test, from the utility cost test especially, and then also from just lowering that threshold. We do see market increases in the overall economic potential over the 12-year period. Slide 47 and 48, I want to walk us through these briefly. In addition to the funding scenarios, the different economic input assumption scenarios, and then the different economic cost test screen scenarios, we also looked at a couple of scenarios around screw-based lighting As I mentioned previously, one of the challenges we had back in 2017, was that there was a new federal administration. There was some uncertainty around some last minute changes that DOE had made in January of 2017. And ultimately in that study, we decided to maintain the assumption that the 2020 ISA backstop standard would go into effect for general service screw-based lamps. Of course, in the intervening years, that hasn't occurred. And so within this study, in our base scenario, which you can see described here in blue, in our base scenario, we're assuming a complete baseline shift to LED in 2027 for general service lamps. But we looked at a couple of accelerations of that baseline shift. And if you look in the light blue, you'll see accelerated ISA compliance 1, where we're assuming for general service LEDs that baseline shift moves up 2 years from 2027 to 2025, and then for specialty bulbs that it shifts from 2031 in our base scenario to 2027. And that low income shifts from 2031 to 2029. And then we ran a second compliance scenario that's again more aggressive. And so assuming now that general service lamps would shift the baseline to LED from 2027 to 2024, the specialty bulbs would also shift from 2029 to 2024, and that the low income would shift from 2031 to 2027. So base scenario, and then an accelerated compliance 1, accelerated compliance 2. This sort of lays out where those changes would happen along the timeline of the potential study. And then if we look at the actual results, we can see this is just looking at residential and commercial potential. What the effect is of the accelerated compliance, or essentially changing the baseline for these screw-based bulbs to be compliant with the ISA backstop, original ISA backstop in 2020. And so, as we would expect to see, obviously, if you accelerate the timeline of that baseline shift, you can see the changes in overall potential, both in the first 4 years and over the full 12 years of the study. And the changes can be relatively noticeable. For example, if we accelerated that baseline in the first scenario, that the total commercial and residential optimized potential over 12 years is 7% lower. And then if we went for the accelerated compliance path 2, we see that it would lower the optimized potential by 14% relative to the base scenario for just residential and commercial customers. And so that was the last scenario we ran. Again, just in summary, these will be detailed in the draft report. We did look at funding scenarios. Then we also reviewed different scenarios related to economic assumption inputs, scenarios related to alternate cost effectiveness tests, and then finally these 2 ISA compliance scenarios. And so, with that, that really brings us to the end of the slides that we had prepared. Wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for discussion, including for the slides we just reviewed in the scenario analysis, but any of the additional information that we discussed during the course of today's meeting. So Jeremy, Mitch, I'm going to pause there, have a sip of water, and see if anybody has any questions. But certainly want to encourage people to either type your questions into the chat box, or if you have anything more specific that you didn't get to ask earlier and would like to ask now, the floor is totally open, and we certainly welcome any questions and discussion.
We did have a chat come in from Masood as we were closing the discussion on the funding scenarios, and I think I'll just invite Masood if you're comfortable to maybe say what you wanted to raise here.
Happy to that. Thank you so much. Yeah, my question is that all stakeholders involved actually sometimes don't have a good understanding of the technical assistance and the subject matter experts that provide assistance, yet the customers who receive this kind of assistance know quite often tell us that sometimes it's more important to them than just getting the incentive. So there is a lot of value that these energy advisors and subject matter experts provide, particularly in the industrial sector. So my question is there a way to capture that value so that all stakeholders can understand its meaning and value to customers in addition to incentives?
Masood, yeah, thanks for your question. Was somebody else about to speak up? Okay. Yeah, thanks, Masood. Thanks for your question. And so, yeah, I agree with you. There is a lot of technical assistance that does need to be provided, particularly for not only non-residential customers, but really all customers. I'm sure there's many variations of technical assistance that's provided in many different applications, ranging from folks at the call center to sort of the description that you have around people who may be visiting sites specifically to make recommendations or just develop an understanding around opportunities that are there. In terms of the potential study and how it captures that value, I don't know if I have a great answer to your question. We really look at interventions, not only from an equipment standpoint and a retrofit standpoint, things like thermal envelopes and controls, but we do take into account consideration of other behavioral components, whether that's it varies sector by sector, and those elements are certainly captured within the potential study, and the value in terms of the energy savings are. But in terms of any other intrinsic benefits or benefits that customers may receive that we don't quantify, I'd have to be honest in saying that we don't really take into account or consideration any of those in our potential study. Not to say that they're not valuable, they just aren't necessarily part of the calculus that we use to estimate potential and its cost effectiveness. So I'll let others add to that. I just want to make sure I provided a perspective from the potential study. And thanks, Masood, for your question. Right. Any other questions?
Nothing in the chat.
All right. Well, it's almost 3 o'clock. Mitch, I'll pause there, see if there's anything you want to add. I think we've got really the last slide here just was a Q&A and next steps. I think we can just reiterate that we'll have the first draft report to stakeholders available in early June, and then a 3-week report review period. And that if you have any feedback or input regarding anything we've talked about today or previously or anything pertaining to the potential study, please don't hesitate to contact us at Cadmus. We've got Jeremy's email here or Mitch at the PSC, and his email is below.
Yeah, thanks for recapping, Lakin. I was just going to make those same points. So always feel free to reach out with any questions or anything like that, and you'll receive a draft report. I'm assuming by email once it's ready, and look for that on June 4th. And there'll be instructions on how to send your feedback and all that. So I just want to once again thank everybody and really appreciate the input and the conversation.
And I'll just add that, as with the other meetings, we are going to post slides on the stakeholder website as well as a recording of the meeting. And I'd also like to say that I really appreciate the really useful feedback that we've gotten during this presentation, and it will help us improve our first draft of our report. So thank you very much.
Right at 2 hours. Did it.
All right. Well, thank you, Mitch, and thanks, everyone. We look forward to hearing your feedback.
Thanks, Lakin.
Thank you.
Thanks.